A woman stood in the doorway. She was visibly pregnant, her dark coat wrapped tightly around her frame despite the warmth of the house. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were locked with purpose. For a moment no one spoke. The lively chatter died. Forks clinked softly against plates, then stilled. She took a step inside. The butler, unnerved, began to protest, "Ma'am, you can't just..." But she ignored him. Instead, her gaze landed directly on the head of the table. The room held its breath. "You thought you could hide from me?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. Before we dive into tonight's chilling case, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We uncover the darkest secrets, the most unexpected betrayals, and the crimes that leave families shattered. If you love real-life mysteries, you're in the right place. Now let's get into it. The evening was supposed to be perfect. A private family dinner filled with warmth, love, and celebration. The house, an elegant estate with towering chandeliers and walls lined with expensive art, was a symbol of success. Inside, the dining room was alive with laughter, the kind of joy that only comes when people feel safe, secure, and untouchable. At the head of the table sat the family patriarch, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. His wife, graceful and poised, was by his side. Their adult children, polished and successful in their own right, engaged in lively conversation. The wine flowed freely, and plates were filled with gourmet dishes prepared by a personal chef. It was a night to celebrate achievements, milestones, and the family's unshakable bond. Or so they thought. The chime of the front doorbell rang, a sound that shouldn't have been out of place but sent an odd tension rippling through the air. The family wasn't expecting anyone. The butler, accustomed to routine and order, hesitated before stepping away from the dining area. Moments later, the door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway. She was visibly pregnant, her dark coat wrapped tightly around her frame despite the warmth of the house. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were locked with purpose. For a moment no one spoke. The lively chatter died. Forks clinked softly against plates, then stilled. She took a step inside. The butler, unnerved, began to protest, "Ma'am, you can't just..." But she ignored him. Instead, her gaze landed directly on the head of the table. The room held its breath. "You thought you could hide from me?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. "You thought you could hide from me?" The words hit like a slap. The man at the head of the table, the man everyone in this room admired, respected, and loved, went pale. His wife turned toward him, confusion flashing across her face before settling into something far worse. His children exchanged uneasy glances, sensing a storm about to break open. And the mistress? She didn't move. She didn't blink. She was exactly where she wanted to be. The air inside the lavish dining room had changed. Gone was the warmth of celebration, the laughter, the feeling of invincibility. In its place was a heavy silence, so thick it seemed to press down on everyone seated at the long, elegant table. At the head of the table, the man who had once commanded every room he walked into sat frozen, his face drained of all color. His hands, which had just moments before been gesturing animatedly as he regaled his family with stories of success, now lay motionless on the tablecloth. Across from him stood her, the pregnant woman who had just shattered the illusion of a perfect evening. Her eyes never wavered. "You thought you could hide from me?" Those words still hung in the air, poisoning the atmosphere like an invisible toxin. The wife's expression had changed from confusion to realization, and then to something far worse, betrayal. But no one spoke, because no one knew what was coming next. To understand how this moment came to be, we have to go back. Months earlier, the affair had begun quietly, discreetly. It started as innocent conversations in dimly lit restaurants, stolen glances across business meetings, and late-night texts under the guise of work. A successful, powerful man who had built an empire on control and discipline had made one critical misstep. He let his guard down. At first it was just excitement, a thrill he hadn't felt in years. A beautiful woman, younger, full of admiration for him, had been easy to succumb to. It was one night at a hotel, then another. Then it became a habit. A business trip turned into an excuse. A delayed flight became a lie waiting to be caught. And through it all, he told himself it wasn't serious. He was in control. Only he wasn't. Because somewhere between the first rendezvous and the last, she had started to want more. And when she told him she was pregnant, his carefully curated world began to crack. He had made a choice, a selfish, calculated choice, to walk away, to block her calls, to pretend it had never happened. He thought if he ignored the truth long enough, it would go away. But secrets never stay buried. And now, standing before him, her presence in his home was proof of that. The silence in the dining room was torturous. Every guest was watching, waiting, no one daring to move. The wife's fingers trembled as she set down her wine glass, her voice barely above a whisper. Who is she? The question wasn't directed at the mistress. It was directed at him. His mouth opened but no words came out. His usual confidence, his ability to smooth over any crisis, had vanished. Because this wasn't just a crisis. It was the end of everything. The mistress stepped forward, her gaze locked on the wife now, her voice edged with something dangerously close to satisfaction. Ask him. Ask your husband who I am. The wife turned to him, desperation in her eyes. Tell me this isn't true. Still he said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. And then the mistress uttered the words that would change everything. I'm pregnant. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a fork, the sound clattering against the porcelain plate. The wife visibly flinched as if the words had physically struck her. Her breathing became uneven. No, she whispered. The mistress placed a hand over her stomach. Yes. The guests, family members who had once believed in the untouchable power of the man at the head of the table, now exchanged stunned, horrified glances. The wife shook her head violently, her voice rising. That's a lie. This is some kind of sick joke. The mistress didn't blink. Oh, it's very real. And you know what's worse? She looked straight at the man who had once whispered promises into her ear. He knew. He's known for months. The wife turned to him, pleading now. Tell me she's lying. And finally he spoke. But his voice lacked conviction. It's not what you think. It was the weakest defense possible. Because everyone knew what that meant. He had just admitted it. Everything after that happened fast. The wife stood, her chair scraping against the floor as she stumbled backward. Her entire world had just collapsed in front of an audience. You disgust me. She wasn't looking at the mistress. She was looking at him. His legacy, his reputation, his perfect life. In an instant, it all shattered. But the mistress wasn't just here for a confrontation. No, she was here for revenge. She had waited for this moment. Planned it. And as she took another step forward, her hand slipping inside the folds of her coat, there was a glint of something in her eyes. Something dangerous. Because this wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making him pay for it. And everyone at that table was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. The dining room remained frozen in shock, but the damage had already been done. The truth had spilled out like a shattered wine glass, impossible to clean up. A man's betrayal, a wife's heartbreak, a mistress's revenge. But this wasn't just another affair gone wrong. Because this woman, the uninvited, the pregnant mistress, wasn't just a scorned lover seeking justice. She had a history. A long, twisted one. And when investigators later uncovered who she really was, it would become terrifyingly clear. This wasn't the first time. And it wouldn't be the last. As the days passed after the dramatic family dinner, the whispers grew louder. The media had picked up the scandal, headlines painting a picture of a powerful man brought to his knees by a woman he thought he could ignore. But it was the investigators, those tasked with untangling the mess, who uncovered the real story. The mistress, known publicly only by a carefully crafted image, had an entire history she had fought to erase. What they found was chilling. She had changed her name multiple times. Each identity was linked to men who had suffered for getting too close to her. A businessman from another city, who had suddenly abandoned his high-profile career after a scandalous affair. A well-connected doctor who had been accused of misconduct, shortly after his involvement with a mysterious woman. A politician who had lost everything after a series of leaked messages, blackmail, and a public meltdown. One thing tied them all together. Her. But her previous lovers had never spoken out. Not publicly. Because by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. And now, this latest victim, a man who once thought he had everything under control, was about to find out just how dangerous she really was. Digging deeper, investigators found restraining orders in different states, documents filed by past lovers, by families desperate to keep her away. But the cases had never led to charges. Each time she had found a way to slip through the cracks, to move on before the walls closed in. Her methods: blackmail, manipulation, emotional warfare. Each story followed a pattern. She would enter a man's life quietly, seemingly harmless, affectionate, devoted. Then she would demand more. Money, commitment, public recognition. And when they refused, that's when things turned dark. She had ruined careers, reputations, and marriages. And in 2 cases the men had completely disappeared. No trace. No answers. Just vanished. Investigators noted something else. Each time she was involved in a scandal, she walked away untouched. Almost like she had planned it that way. And that led them to the most terrifying question of all. Was this just another scandal? Or was something far more sinister about to unfold? As the investigation continued, a disturbing discovery surfaced. Just days before the dinner, the night she walked in uninvited, carrying her unborn child in her rage, she had been seen purchasing something strange. Security footage from a local hardware store showed her browsing the aisles. She wasn't there for ordinary supplies. She was methodical, careful, precise in her selections. A roll of thick rope, duct tape, a hunting knife, and an untraceable burner phone. The clerk remembered her well, because unlike most customers she had seemed calm. Not someone preparing for a home project, but someone is preparing for something far worse. When investigators pieced it together, the picture became clear. This wasn't just revenge. This wasn't just about exposing the affair. This was something much, much darker. And if they didn't stop her in time, it might just end in murder. The dining room, once filled with laughter and toasts, had become a battlefield of secrets, betrayal, and fear. The air was thick with tension, a silence so sharp it could cut through steel. The pregnant mistress stood at the center of it all, her presence transforming the once warm family gathering into a scene out of a nightmare. Everyone was waiting for her next move, for the next explosion. And then she reached into her bag. The moment her fingers disappeared into the depths of her handbag, the wife jerked back in her chair, her breath catching in her throat. Had she come armed? Was she hiding a gun? A knife? The husband's face, already drained of all color, turned a sickly pale. His hands gripped the edge of the table as if he were bracing for the inevitable. The guests, once mere spectators to a scandal, were now frozen in a new kind of horror, the kind where someone might not leave this room alive. One of them, an older relative, pushed his chair back ever so slightly. A quiet movement, barely noticeable. But the mistress noticed. Her sharp eyes flickered toward him. "Sit down." The voice that came out of her was deadly calm, the kind of calm that was far more terrifying than screaming. And everyone knew in that moment that this woman was capable of anything. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pulled something from the bag. A bottle. What? But was it really just that? She set the bottle on the table. Her fingers traced the label almost lovingly before she turned to the stunned wife. A toast. No one moved. No one spoke. A toast? To what? The wife's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. The mistress poured herself a glass. The deep, red liquid sloshed softly against the crystal. Then she reached for another empty glass. She turned it toward the wife. "Drink with me." A challenge. A dare. A trap. The wife's hands remained in her lap, clenched into tight fists. She didn't reach for the glass. The mistress sighed, almost disappointed. "I came here to tell the truth," she said, swirling the wine in her own glass. "To make sure everyone knows exactly who your husband is. But more importantly..." She glanced down at her pregnant belly before bringing the glass closer to her lips. "To get justice." Then she took a sip. The entire room collectively held its breath. Had she just poisoned herself? For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the soft clink as she set her glass back down on the table. Then, a gasp. A sharp inhale of breath that turned into a choke. Someone collapsed against the table. The glass slipped from their hand, shattering into a million sharp fragments across the polished floor. Screams erupted. The wife staggered backward, knocking over her chair. Her hands covered her mouth in horror. The guests jumped up from their seats, but no one knew what to do. The husband's eyes bulged as he looked down at the body on the floor. Was it the mistress? Had she poisoned herself? His breath hitched. No, it wasn't her. It was him. His hands clutched at his throat. His body convulsed as he gasped for air. His eyes darted frantically to his wine glass, as if he were trying to make sense of what was happening. The glass was still half full, the dark liquid inside untouched. But his lips had already turned blue. Panic spread through the room like wildfire. Someone yelled for an ambulance. Someone else ran to his side, shaking him, trying to make him respond. But his body had already gone limp. The mistress watched it all unfold with cold, detached eyes, as if this was exactly what she had expected to happen. The guests were in a frenzy. The wife was screaming for someone to help him. The older relatives were praying, shaking their heads in disbelief. But the mistress just sat back down, composed, and then she smiled. Not a wide, maniacal grin, just a knowing smirk, as if she had already won. The wife's eyes snapped toward her, wild with rage and grief. "What did you do?" The mistress tilted her head. "I didn't do anything." Her voice was eerily steady. "I told you. I only came here for the truth." Her fingers tapped lightly against her wine glass. "Maybe your husband was just hiding another secret." The wife's breath hitched. The mistress leaned in slightly, her next words barely above a whisper. "Some men dig their own graves." Paramedics arrived moments later, pushing through the chaos, assessing the collapsed man on the floor. The wife was inconsolable. The guests were still frozen in horror. And the mistress? She stood up, smoothing out her dress. She glanced at the wife one last time. "Take care of that baby." Then, before anyone could stop her, she walked out, leaving behind a house full of shattered lives, unanswered questions, and a dying man who might not make it through the night. But was this really the end? Or had she planned every moment of this night from the start? One thing was clear. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a reckoning. And the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and family prestige, had become a crime scene. Police cars lined the driveway, their flashing lights cutting through the night like warning signals. Inside, forensic investigators moved methodically, collecting evidence, dusting for prints, and tagging every shattered piece of glass from the night's horrific events. The air was thick with unanswered questions. Who poisoned the wine? Who was the intended target? And most chilling of all, was this part of a carefully calculated plan? The investigators had one job: unravel the truth before the killer struck again. Detective Monroe stepped into the dining room, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The table was still set for celebration. Half-empty plates, wine glasses smeared with fingerprints, expensive candles flickering softly in their holders. A grotesque contrast to the disaster that had unfolded. At the center of it all, a single glass of wine sat untouched. It was the husband's glass, the one he had barely raised to his lips before collapsing in agony. Nearby, the mistress's glass, empty. Monroe turned to his forensic team. "Tell me what we have." The lead investigator glanced at his notes. Preliminary analysis suggests poison in the wine. The husband took a sip, then collapsed. The wife didn't drink. The mistress did, but she seems fine. So, was the poison in only his glass? Monroe asked. "Too soon to tell. We need a full toxicology report to confirm." Monroe nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. Someone had planned this. The question was, who? And, more disturbingly, was the real target still alive? One by one, the dinner guests were escorted to a separate sitting room for questioning. The first to speak was an older relative, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. "She wasn't normal," she whispered. "That woman, the mistress, she walked in like she owned the place. But it was more than that, there was something in her eyes." "Something like what?" Monroe pressed. She hesitated before answering. Like she already knew how the night would end. Monroe scribbled something down. Premeditation. The next witness, a younger cousin, offered another disturbing detail. "I saw her texting before dinner started," she said. "She was acting strange, checking her phone constantly. And when I looked over, she smiled. Like she knew something we didn't." Monroe's ears perked up. "Did you see what she was texting?" The cousin shook her head. "No. But she put her phone away the second things got tense. Almost like she didn't need it anymore." Monroe exchanged a glance with his team. Was she working with someone else? Or was she simply confirming that the plan was already in motion? The final, and most telling, testimony came from the wife herself. She was still shaken, her eyes red from crying, her voice hoarse from screaming for help. But there was something else. Something beyond grief. Suspicion. "She drank the wine," the wife said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She drank it and nothing happened to her." Monroe leaned forward. "You think she knew it was poisoned?" The wife swallowed hard, her hands clenching in her lap. "I think she wanted him dead." By the following morning, the medical examiner's report arrived. The toxicology results confirmed it. The wine was poisoned. The substance? A rare, slow-acting toxin. Not something easily obtained. Not something accidental. Monroe flipped through the pages, his pulse quickening as he reached the most disturbing revelation of all. The poison had been present in both the husband's and the mistress's glasses. Yet only one had collapsed. What? A follow-up test gave the answer. The mistress had taken a counteragent beforehand. A precaution. A shield against her own weapon. Monroe exhaled sharply, his stomach turning. She had planned this to the last detail. She had known exactly what was in that wine. And she had made sure she was the only one who would survive it. Monroe leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It all made sense now. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution. And the most chilling part? The mastermind behind it was still walking free. The only question left: would they be able to stop her before she struck again? The case had already shaken the family to its core. But as the investigation pressed forward, it became clear, this wasn't just about one poisoned glass of wine. There was more. More secrets. More lies. More destruction waiting to unfold. And at the center of it all, the pregnant mistress, a woman who had walked into that dinner with a plan far bigger than anyone had realized. Now, the detectives were about to uncover the final piece of her twisted game. The break in the case came when officers obtained a search warrant for the mistress's apartment. It was a modest place, too modest for a woman who had spent years entangled in an affair with a wealthy man. Detective Monroe scanned the room, taking in the perfectly arranged furniture, the pristine kitchen, the absence of personal touches. It was as if she had never intended to stay here long. That's when one of the officers called out, "Detective, you might want to see this." In the bedroom, tucked inside the drawer of a nightstand, was an envelope. Inside, a handwritten letter. The ink was fresh, the words precise and deliberate, like someone had taken their time crafting each sentence. And as Monroe read the first few lines, a chill ran down his spine. "To whoever finds this, I know what you're thinking. But you're wrong. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. If everything has gone as planned, then by the time you read this, one man will be dead, another will be destroyed, and the real monster, well, let's just say they won't be getting away with it this time. Because I made sure of it." Monroe's grip on the paper tightened. She wasn't just after the husband. She was setting someone else up. But who? And for what? As Monroe dug deeper, he ordered a cross-check of the mistress's history, her past relationships, past associates, even past residences. What they found was disturbing. 3 years ago, in a different city, there had been a similar case. A man poisoned at a high-profile event. A mistress at the center of the scandal. And a letter, found weeks later, suggesting it was never about the man but about something much bigger. Monroe's hands shook as he read through the old case file. This isn't the first time she's done this. Was this a pattern? Had she spent years hunting down specific men? Or had she been targeting someone else entirely? And if she had planned for multiple deaths before, had they just stopped her before she finished the job this time? The final piece of the puzzle came from within the family itself. Someone knew more than they had admitted. It started with the wife. During her second interview, she hesitated when Monroe asked her a simple question. "Before that night, did you ever meet her?" Her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. Then, in a barely audible whisper, "Once." Monroe's pulse jumped. "When?" A long silence. Then, 3 months ago, was a bombshell. She had met the mistress? And yet, she had acted so shocked when she barged into the dinner. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Monroe asked, his voice sharp. The wife exhaled shakily. "Because I didn't think it mattered." "Didn't think it mattered?" Monroe echoed. The wife swallowed. "She came to me first. She said she had information about my husband. She wanted to meet, alone. I agreed." Monroe leaned in. "What information?" The wife looked down at her lap. "She told me my husband was dangerous. That he wasn't just a liar, he was a killer." The room went silent. Monroe's breath caught. "Did you believe her?" The wife hesitated. "I didn't know what to believe. But now, after everything, I'm starting to wonder if she was telling the truth." A heavy silence settled between them. The implications were staggering. Had the husband been hiding something far worse than an affair? Was the mistress a victim seeking justice? Or a manipulator setting up her own game? And most terrifying of all, if she was still out there, was she planning to strike again? Monroe slammed the case file shut. This wasn't over. Not even close. The letter, the past crime, the wife's secret meeting, they were all pieces of something bigger. Somewhere out there, the mistress was still pulling strings. And the question wasn't just who was truly guilty. It was, who was the real target all along? The family knew more than they admitted. Who was truly orchestrating the night's events? The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, reporters whispering among themselves, cameras flashing outside the courthouse. This wasn't just a trial. It was a spectacle. The world wanted to know, Was the mistress a cold-blooded killer? Or had she been pushed to the edge by a man who had manipulated and discarded her? The prosecution and defense would battle to control the narrative, but in the end, only 12 jurors would decide her fate. And no one, not even the judge, could predict what they would rule. The lead prosecutor, James Holloway, stood and buttoned his suit jacket. He turned to the jury, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case of self-defense. This is not a crime of passion. This is premeditated murder." He took slow, measured steps toward the jury box. The defendant, who walked into a family dinner uninvited, knew exactly what she was doing. She brought poison. She drank a counteragent. She played the victim while setting up the perfect crime. A dramatic pause. This was not about heartbreak. This was about revenge. The prosecution then laid out their evidence. The letter was found in her apartment, hinting at a larger scheme. The toxicology report, proving she had ingested an antidote before the poisoning. The previous unresolved case that bore eerie similarities to this one. Then came the witnesses. The guests at the dinner testified about the way the mistress acted that night, her eerie calm, the cryptic things she said. The medical examiner confirmed that the poison had been slow-acting, meant to ensure the victim suffered. And then, the wife took the stand. She had been reluctant to testify. Her emotions had been pulled in every direction. But in the end, she faced the mistress from across the courtroom and said, "She told me my husband was a monster, that he deserved to die." The words rang in the air like a death sentence. The prosecution rested their case. The defense attorney, Lisa Gardner, was a veteran in the courtroom. She had defended high-profile clients, people the world wanted to see behind bars. But this was different. She stood, adjusted her glasses, and faced the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my client is a monster, a cold-blooded killer. But I ask you, have you considered the alternative?" A slight pause. "That maybe she is the one who was manipulated?" The defense began to peel back the layers of the case. They painted the mistress as a woman scorned, abandoned, and humiliated. The husband had lied to her for years, making promises he never intended to keep. When she confronted him, he gaslit her, called her unstable. And when she realized the truth, that she had been used and discarded, she snapped. "But does that make her a murderer?" Gardner asked, stepping closer to the jury. "Or does it make her a woman who made a desperate mistake?" Then came the defense's biggest weapon, the husband's past. For weeks, the prosecution had focused only on the mistress. But now, the defense turned the spotlight onto the victim himself. Financial records showed questionable transactions, large sums of money transferred to unknown accounts. Old business partners testified that he had a reputation for deception, that he used people, then discarded them. And most damning of all, his connection to the previous murder case. "This is a man who wasn't just a cheater," Gardner said. "This is a man with secrets. And my client was the only one brave enough to confront him." The jury shifted in their seats. Doubt had been planted. Was she really the mastermind? Or had she been caught in something much bigger? For 3 days, the jury deliberated. The world waited. Social media exploded with debates. Was she a murderer? Or a victim of a powerful man's deception? Then, finally, the verdict was in. The courtroom was silent as the judge looked down at the paper. A deep breath. "On the charge of first-degree murder." Pause. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The mistress held her breath. The wife clutched the edge of her seat. And then, "Not guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution's team froze in shock. The mistress exhaled, hands trembling. But then the judge continued. "On the charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty." Manslaughter. A lesser charge. Not murder, but not innocent either. The sentence? 10 years in prison. The trial had ended. The courtroom had emptied. The cameras had moved on. But for the people left behind, the nightmare was far from over. The verdict had been delivered, guilty of manslaughter. 10 years behind bars. And yet, justice still felt elusive. Because while the mistress had been convicted, the deepest questions remained unanswered. Who was truly at fault? Who had orchestrated the chaos? And most terrifying of all, was the danger really over? For the family at the center of the storm, the damage was irreparable. The wife, once the picture of grace and control, was now a shell of her former self. Her marriage had been exposed as a lie. Her husband had died a horrific public death. Her name had been dragged through the media for months. And now, she was left to pick up the pieces alone. Her in-laws had turned on her, blaming her for the scandal. Her social circle had vanished overnight. No one wanted to be associated with the wife of a dead cheater, a woman whose world had collapsed in front of the world. And the family's finances? Shattered. Legal fees, settlements, and public disgrace had drained everything. What was once a powerful, untouchable family was now a cautionary tale. And for the wife, the worst part wasn't the loss of money or reputation. It was the fact that she would never truly know the full truth. Her husband had died before she could get answers. And the only person who might know them was now behind bars. The media had called her many things. A vengeful woman, a cunning seductress, a manipulator who played the long game. But when the cell door clanged shut behind her, none of those titles mattered anymore. Because now, she was just another inmate. At first she tried to adapt, kept her head down, avoided trouble. But the whispers followed her. Inmates had seen the news. They knew what she had done. And in prison, women like her, who made national headlines, who betrayed other women, who had played with poison, they weren't welcomed. The threats started within days. The first time, someone left a razor blade on her pillow. The second time, she found a note scratched into the wall of her cell. "Poison doesn't work here, sweetheart. Let's see what happens." She wasn't safe. Not inside. And not outside either. Because if she ever got out, there were still people waiting for her. People who wanted revenge of their own. People who didn't believe justice had been served. Months later, after the trial had faded from public memory, the wife sat alone in what was once her beautiful home. The furniture was gone. The walls were bare. All that remained were the ghosts of a life she no longer recognized. She picked up a single newspaper, the last one she had bothered to read. The headline? "The Mistress of Poison, a love affair that ended in death." She read the words slowly. Then she laughed. Because they still didn't get it. They still thought this was about an affair. About a jealous woman who went too far. They didn't realize this was never just about love. This was about power, deception, control. And the most terrifying part? She still wasn't sure who had really been pulling the strings. Somewhere out there, the real mastermind might still be free. Waiting. Planning. And if she had learned anything from this nightmare, it was this. Some stories never truly end.